Our next game is another beautiful game of Bobby Fischer's, where he had the black pieces against Robert Byrne this time, the brother of Donald Byrne that we saw the game in the first game. And this game is included in John Nann's book, The World's Greatest Chess Games. Sit back and enjoy. So Robert Byrne is white and Bobby Fischer is black. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, and g3. Here black still has a choice to decide to play the King's Indian. That would involve putting the pawn on d6 or put the pawn on d5 now or in a few moves, and that's the Grunfeld defense. This game is played at the US Championship in New York in 1963. Black played c6, preparing d5, bishop g2. In the previous year's tournament, US Championship, in 1962, Robert Byrne played d5 in this position, and Bobby got a good game after playing b5. So in this game, bishop g2 came and d5. And white took and black took. Well, this is the so-called symmetrical variation of the Grunfeld defense that has the reputation of being very drawish, hard to lose for either color. But as you'll see, things are not so simple, especially when you play Bobby Fischer. Knight c3, white continued developing, and so did black by playing bishop to g7. In this position, white played e3. That's a relatively rare move in this position. A lot more common is to play knight f3. That seems a lot more logical to get ready to castle. That's what Paul Banker played against Bobby Fischer in the 1962 US Championship. e3. Now, I have to tell you, I don't like this move in principle, because when you fianchetto your bishop, you put your bishop on g2, and you already opened up some light squares by playing g3. It's not very healthy to open up more and weaken the white squares around f3, g2, h3 squares. So I think that's a small mistake. Black castle, and the white knight came to e2. Obviously, that was the reason why white played e3, the last move. Black continued developing, and white castled. And black played b6 to develop the bishop along this diagonal. And white did the same by playing b3 and bishop a6. Now we can see that it's a little bit uncomfortable for white already, because the bishop is pinning the knight on e2. Bishop went to a3, and the black rook went out of the pin, playing rook e8, so black can play e5 sometime soon. In this moment, white played queen d2, ignoring black's plan of playing e5. If white would have played f4 to prevent black's idea of playing e5, it's certainly safer. Black's plan would be to play perhaps rook c8 first, and let's say after rook c1, play e6, followed by a possible offer of trade of bishops, and then, after the bishops are disappearing from there, get the rook to e7, double up on c7, with approximately equal position, maybe a slight edge for black. Going back to our game, black played, after queen d2, e5 right away. This is what Bobby Fischer said. I was a bit worried about weakening my d-pawn, but I felt that the tremendous activity obtained by my minor pieces would permit white no time to exploit it. meaning the d5 pawn after the trade on e5. White took on e5, although it was better to ignore this and just play rook a to c1. However, in the game, white played pawn takes e5 and knight took on e5. And this is a critical moment in the game. It's a very complicated, complex position. Practically all the pieces are on the board except a couple of pawns that are traded off. And the game is around the pawn on d5 from white's perspective, and black's how he can create counterplay against that weakness that he voluntarily created, the isolated pawn on d5. White could not take the pawn right away because the white queen is overworked. After knight d5, knight would take on d5, queen would take on d5. Black would trade queens and then capture the knight on e2. Now both rooks are hanging, but after bishop takes rook, and white takes either with the king or the rook may be better, the bishop, rook takes bishop, and as a result black has an extra knight for only one pawn in return. Let's go back to our critical position again. In the game, white played here rook f to d1. Now that's one of the hardest things in chess, even for strong world-class grandmasters. Which rook to put where? Sometimes it's obvious, in other cases it's tricky. There are 3 choices and you only got 2 rooks. So in this case, white chose the wrong rook. It was better to come to d1 with the rook from a1, which is surprising in a way because it leaves the knight still in the pin. In that case, black's best move would be to play queen c8. Let's proceed with the game. The rook from f1 went to d1. Why was that bad? The problem became that the pawn on f2 has been left alone, and that's what Bobby will use very quickly. The knight jumped in to d3. Now the threat is to play knight e4, because the knight on c3 is kind of in a pin, because the rook behind would be hanging. And white made a second mistake in this position. Played queen to c2 to attack the knight on d3. Let's go through some other options what white had here. For example, if the knight moves to f4, black's plan would be knight e4, knight takes e4, and now bishop takes a1. When knight d6 lets white escape, attacking the rook now and the bishop on a1, but simply taking back the knight on e4, and after rook goes to b1, rook c8, threatening with coming the bishop to c3, and after bishop b4, that stops that. Knight takes on f4, pawn takes knight, queen takes queen, and now if the bishop takes, the white rooks get trapped by very cute bishop d3, rook c1, bishop c2, rook f1, bishop b2, rook e1, and bishop d3. It's kind of a nice maneuver to trap the white rooks. Again, let me set the position back to where white could have taken back with the rook instead of the bishop. Right, so after rook takes d2, black would continue with bishop d3, rook b d1, and a5, chasing the bishop away and then bishop c3, again trapping the white rooks. Okay, let's get back to the game. After the queen c2 move, that was a mistake, or rather the decisive mistake for white. Here is the critical moment in the game. I would like you to take some time and try to figure out what's the correct continuation here for black. Bobby Fischer continued here with another brilliant combination. Knight captures on f2, sacrificing the knight. King captured back, and knight g4 check came. Bobby Fischer, shortly after the game, visiting the Marshall Chess Club, made an interesting comment that Tal, the former world champion Mikhail Tal, who was very famous for his sometimes risky combinations, he would have tried maybe rook takes e3, king takes, knight g4, king d2, rook c8, but it's a little bit risky, it's very complicated, and black is a rook and a knight down. This is not Fischer style. Bobby played a much safer and, I would say, objectively better knight g4 check. King g1, and now Bobby took the pawn on e3, making a fork on the white queen and white rook. Queen went to d2. And this was another brilliant moment in the game. Black has the option to simply take the rook on d1, allowing white to play rook d1. And the pawn on d5 would be in trouble, and white would have very good chances not to lose this game. However, that was not what Bobby planned. It's a beautiful example of showing how the two bishops can work together on the open diagonals. Let's see what happened now. Bobby rather took the bishop, which is a key bishop defending the white king. King took back on g2, and d4 came, another pawn sacrifice, opening the diagonal for black's light squared bishop. White took the pawn, and the bishop came to check from b7. Now the king can go to several places. In the game, white went to f1. However, let's walk through the variations, what could have happened if the king went to some other places. For example, if the king goes to g1, the plan was to capture on d4, queen captures back, and now a typical deflection combination, playing rook e1. And now, for example, after king f2, of course, if rook takes, then the white queen is lost. And if king goes to f2, then black trades queens, rook takes back, and rook takes, resulting in black having an extra rook and pawn for only a knight, being up an exchange and a pawn. Let's see the variation, what happens if the king goes instead. 1 second. If the king goes to f2 instead of g1, which we just saw, in that case black simply brings the queen closer to the action, queen d7, and let's say rook c1, then queen h3, threatening with checkmate on g2. If knight f3 blocks the black bishop's diagonal, then the other bishop comes into the play from h6, followed by queen d3 and bishop e3, forcing white to lose material. In the game, white, as I said, in this position, where we were giving the check with the bishop on b7, white played king f1. And now the final move of the game, again the queen coming simply to d7, and the unavoidable threat of playing queen h3. And it's kind of interesting what would have happened if white does not resign here. After queen f2, the plan was to play queen h3 check, king g1. In this position, I'd like you to sit back for a moment and try to figure out, why did Robert Byrne resign? and not wanted to see what happens if he plays this way. This is the move that, according to many, is one of the most brilliant moves ever played. The funny thing is, it was never played, actually, in the game, because Robert Byrne resigned 2 moves ago. The move that we're talking about is Rook E1. It's a brilliant move because either the white queen or rook could capture the rook, but really neither one can. After the queen captures, black checkmates right away. And in case the rook captures, black will take the knight on d4, pinning the white queen. And if queen takes the bishop, then again the checkmate comes on g2. Also, if white does not capture the bishop on d4 in this position, black's threat is anyway to just play queen g2 checkmate. I hope you have enjoyed this game. I certainly did. I've seen it several times before, but every time I see it again, it's enjoyment for me. What did white do wrong in this game? Well, the first thing I did not like in white's game here, when he played g3 and then a few moves later e3. I recommend decide which diagonal your bishop is planning to go on. If you wanted to go on the a6 f1 diagonal, play e3 or e4. If you want to put your bishop on g2 to fianchetto, play g3. But in general, it's not the greatest idea to mix them. Then later, when they reached the critical positions with the isolated pawn, those are very, very complex positions. So try to calculate accurately and don't leave weaknesses, like white did in this game, the f2 pawn.